And you are podcasting with Gary DeMar. Let's figure things out.
I'm a worldview guy. The only reason I got involved, I shouldn't say the only reason I got involved in the topic of eschatology was because it was a necessary apologetic because of the work I've done on worldview issues. When I first wrote the God and Government series, there was, and this was 1982 for the first volume, 84, the second volume, 86. The third volume, I do have a chapter in the third volume on eschatology, but not as detailed as I've written in my books, Wars and Rumors of Wars or Last Days Madness, and other books on prophecy. The interesting thing about it when I went out to speak on the topic of eschatology, and invariably someone would say, why are we bothering with this? Because Jesus is coming soon. Now you need to remember those dates, 82, 84, and 86. Hal Lindsey had written The Late Great Planet Earth in 1970. He had done in 1948 the beginning of the end time generation. Generation was 40 years. 40 plus 48 gave you 1988. So that was kind of the rapture generation time period. And so people were really focused on that. The Late Great Planet Earth sold in the neighborhood of 25 million copies. And so people were geared up for the rapture, very much like many people are today. So it was an apologetic that I needed in order to say, wait a minute, God has called us, He's created us in Christ Jesus for good works. We're new creatures in Christ. We are to take that new creaturely basis for our lives and implement it into every area of life. Why otherwise leave us all here on the earth to do what if we're not supposed to be involved in worldview issues? And so if you look at the books that I wrote in the 80s and the early 90s, they were all worldview books. I wrote Ruler of the Nations, which was kind of a condensation of my God and Government series. I did that for the Biblical Blueprint series that Gary North had published. I did Surviving College successfully, which was a book to help young people deal with the rigors of academic nonsense. And I gave them an apologetic methodology in order to help them with that, as well as study skill issues. Myths, Lies, and Half-Truths. It was originally titled You've Heard It Said, and that was designed to help Christians answer people who said, well, Jesus said his kingdom is not of this world. Politics is dirty. There's a separation between church and state. You can't impose your morality on other people. We need to be neutral. And there's a whole list of those types of myths, lies, and half-truths. And I covered those things in there as well. And when my first book, Last Days Madness, came out, which was originally published by Wolgemuth and Hyatt, which was a publishing house in Brentwood, Tennessee, I think Bob Wolgemuth and Mike Hyatt worked for Thomas Nelson, and they wanted to go on their own, and they created their own imprint. And they were looking for almost anything to publish, and hey, I was okay with that. And they took my Last Days Madness book, the God and Government series, Surviving College, successfully, which received a Book of the Year honorable mention because of it. In fact, David Chilton had written a book dealing with the AIDS epidemic. So that's what I did, and there was nothing controversial about my eschatology back then. I debated a number of people, Dave Hunt and Thomas Ice, and other people over the years. Most of them, Dave Hunt and Thomas Ice. Ken Gentry and I did a debate with Thomas Ice and Dave Hunt that was supposed to come out on the John Ankerberg show, but they never showed it. I was a last-minute substitute. Greg Bonson had called me and said, Gary, he was not feeling well and wanted to know if I could take his place, and it wasn't something I really wanted to do because I did not trust John Ankerberg. I was told by a very good friend of mine, I won't tell who it is, but she said, do not trust John Ankerberg. And I was right. You could not trust the guy. It was an all Dallas seminary type audience, and even Dave Hunt kind of leaned over. There were two chairs and two chairs with a little table in the middle, and Dave Hunt and I were just next to one another, this little table. And he even leaned over and said he had never seen John do something like this, and that was just the way he was approaching this whole debate. Completely went against what we were supposed to talk about, and they've never shown it, which is kind of interesting. I don't know who told them they didn't want it shown. I just do not know what happened with it. So, but to get back to why I got involved in the eschatology thing was because people were saying we're living in the last days. Rapture's right around the corner. Why are you bothering with this? So I wrote an apologetic in Last Days Madness to deal with those issues. And everything was smooth sailing for the longest time. And over the years, over the years, people would ask me questions related to eschatology that went beyond the kind of the Marcellus kick, everything that Matthew 24 is divided at verses 35 and 36. Everything before verse 35 deals with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and then after 35, 36 to the end of chapter 25, that refers to the second coming. That was a position that was in Marcellus Kick's book. And I was an advocate of that position for a very long time. And then as I did more reading and study, I said, I don't think that works. And not to trust my own abilities with all of this, I searched out others to see what they had to say. And there were a number of people who said, no, that's not where the division is. Some took it later in chapter 24 and 25. Adam Clark, I think John Gill to a certain extent, and there were others. And so I felt I was on safe ground, although Ken Gentry did not agree with me. He took the same position that Greg Bonson did, that there was a division there. And they also took the view that Luke chapter 17 was referring to the Christ's second coming, and I took issue with that. I dealt with it. I think I dealt with it in a very positive way, and I don't want to say irrefutable, but certainly irrefutable up until the midpoint in Matthew chapter 25. And then what happened was Walt Hibbard, who had started a bookstore. This is maybe before the internet, Puritan Reformed books, and he sold basically Reformed literature, and he had come across a book. He was kind of tinkering with the eschatology side of things as well, and then he found this book by James Stuart Russell called the Parousia, and he was able to convince Baker Bookhouse to republish it. Maybe they thought he was going to sell a lot of copies of it. Apparently he did. The book has been in print. Ed Stevens keeps it in print. I don't know if he's still printing it. We've always thought about reprinting it as well. And it was endorsed by R.C. Sproul, Ken Gentry, and me. And it was on the back cover. I mean, Ken Gentry gave it a rousing endorsement. And I don't know if he said that there's some things he disagreed with. That's fine. But that was essentially, it took the whole modern preterist movement beyond what the traditional dividing line on what they call partial preterism and full preterism. And James Stuart Russell, rustled the feathers of a lot of people because of that book. But hey, Sproul said it was okay. Spurgeon said it was okay as well. He had some very nice comments to say about it, but he said he didn't agree with everything. But Charles Spurgeon said, hey man, this will rock your world. There's a lot of really good things in here. And I suspect a lot of people who read the Parousia, said, I never thought of that before. I never really heard that argument before. And that was the case. So that kind of became a catalyst for what is today the full preterist movement. And again, I kept getting questions from people. And on the basis of those questions, I did more and more research. And the research, continued. And I was asking questions. I was asking questions of myself on, wait a minute, Gary, how do you deal with that passage? You always have to do this. It was the same when I debated dispensationalists. You always had to keep in the back of your mind, how would a dispensationalist respond to my claims against their position? What would they say in answer to it? That's always something that you have to do. And it's the same thing when you deal with the further advance of preterism. You're always going to have to answer the question, oh, wait a minute, Gary, if you say that, then how does that fit with this, and this, and this? And that's legitimate, and it has to be done. And this, of course, it's the same with the other side. They've got to deal with a lot of these questions, and when people ask them, and they haven't had to do that for many, many years because the traditional end-time perspective that was non-dispensational just didn't deal with a lot of passages that didn't necessarily relate to what we would describe traditionally as the second coming. The time indicators were very clear about that. The use of mellow, about to, and other items in there say, well, wait a minute, this seems to be something related to what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. And as a result of that, you had to deal with those things, and they deal with those passages. And I was willing to ask those questions, and I went on a limb with some of them, and it got me in a lot of trouble. And I'm okay with that. I'm pushing the envelope, and let me just say, I get email messages and phone calls from people all over the world who have been asking the same questions, and they've been dissatisfied with a number of the responses from the traditional kind of partial preterist guys out there. And many of them kind of came into preterism through my works, Ken Gentry's works, and they're just kind of surprised that, Ken Gentry would take a position on, say, Revelation chapter 1:7 and spend 22 pages saying, well, when it says that every eye will see him, that this is not referring to the second coming. This is an event regarding the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, because she always throws a caveat in there by saying, well, obviously this is the prelude to he wouldn't say a dual fulfillment, but it's kind of a type of Jesus coming again at the end of history. He always throws that in there. He does the same thing with Daniel chapter 12. No, that's not referring to the resurrection of people at the end of history. This is during the transitional period between AD 30 and AD 70. But he always says, but this is kind of a type of what's going to happen at the end of history. And a lot of people just were asking questions, related to all of this, and were confused. And so, that's kind of gotten me into trouble with a lot of these people. And again, I don't mind this. I like being pressed. I like the competition. It forces me to study more. I do not have everything worked out. Nobody does. I don't care what the systematic theologies say. They don't have it all worked out. They cannot distinguish between the coming of Jesus in AD 70, which partial preterists believed, taught, wrote about, debated. Ken Gentry did a written debate that Kregel Publications published. It was on the Great Tribulation. So Ken took the preterist position. He has since kind of tweaked his position on that. He no longer believes that Matthew 24, verse 27, is part of this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And I know why he did that, because when you get into chapter 25, the same language is used. And if they mean the same thing in chapter 24, Matthew 24, it means the lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and then it's got to mean the same thing in Matthew chapter 25. And Ken can't do that because he believes that there is a transition. So he said, well, 24, 27, that refers to the second coming. Marcellus Kick did the same thing. So this is where we are today, where we find that these guys cannot consistently make a distinction between what passages refer to AD 70 and which passages definitively apply to the destruction, the second coming, and which coming passages don't refer to either. You got Revelation chapters 2 and 3, which Jesus threatens to come to those particular churches in that particular period of time. So this is just kind of some background to some of the debates that I may be having in the future, just to let people know I'm a worldview guy, and I'm involved in eschatology because of the worldview implications of it. And some of the questions that are being asked of me don't have any worldview consequences. To say that when a person dies, they get their body at the time of death and not when Jesus returns physically at the end of history, that's not a worldview issue. That's not going to change how you live in the present and how you might work and use the world in which God has given it you. Or the fact that there aren't any verses in the New Testament that can definitively be said to apply to Jesus' physical coming at the end of history. That should not change the way you are living in the world today. And I certainly have no problem with someone who says, well, Jesus is going to return one day. Obviously, if Jesus wants to return someday and do something, that's nothing I can say about that. I just don't know any definitive verses that specifically say that. If someone wants to believe that, that's okay. It doesn't affect my worldview perspective and what I do as a worldview thinker in terms of the Bible. So this kind of short dialogue with myself over all of this, hopefully it puts a few things in perspective. If you want more information, at least on the preterist beliefs, you can go to my Last Days Madness, which you can get at AmericanVision.org, Wars and Rumors of Wars, Prophecy Wars, the Rapture of the Fig Tree Generation, the hermeneutical approach to Bible prophecy that I did with Kim Burgess, in the Hope of Israel, and lots of other things. And so hopefully this will give you a little background of where I'm coming from and where I came from and why eschatology right now for me is such a debatable topic, because tons and tons of people are talking Bible eschatology.
Thanks for podcasting with Gary DeMar. Please subscribe and share this with anyone you think really needs to hear it.